Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome to AI and the Future of Work, episode 287. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And the added bonus, you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's AI fun fact: Margaret Mitchell, Chief Ethics Scientist at Hugging Face and founder of Google's ethical AI team, writes in Time Online that ethical AI isn't to blame for Google's recent Gemini debacle. In the article, Mitchell argues that the idea that ethical AI work is to blame is just wrong. In fact, Gemini showed Google wasn't correctly applying the lessons of AI ethics. Where AI ethics focuses on addressing foreseeable use cases such as historical depictions, Gemini seems to have opted for a one-size-fits-all approach, resulting in an awkward mix of refreshingly diverse and cringeworthy outputs. One of the critical pieces in operationalizing ethics in AI is articulating foreseeable use, including malicious use and misuse. That means working through questions such as, once the model we're thinking of building is deployed, how will people actually use it? And how can we design it to be as beneficial as possible for these contexts? It's a well-researched piece from a great researcher who's a true domain expert. I encourage you to read the full article, which of course we will link to in the show notes. Now, shifting to this week's conversation, Kendall Clark is the co-founder and CEO of Stardog, a leading enterprise knowledge graph platform that boasts customers like Morgan Stanley, Raytheon, Bosch, and NASA. Kendall started the company in 2016 based on a vision about how the world should access data in a meaningful way. He taught himself to code in his 20s and is on a mission to help mere mortals have, in his words, aha experiences with data more often. Stardog recently launched VoiceBox, a conversational data platform that helps knowledge workers speak to enterprise data. Thank you to mutual investor Jonathan Pearl from Boulder Ventures for the intro to Kendall. And without further ado, Kendall, it's my pleasure to welcome you to AI and the Future of Work. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about your background and how you got into this space.
Thank you, Dan. Always fun to spend time with you. This is not our first time, it won't be our last, but I think it's the first time that's been recorded and memorialized for others. So I feel a little bit of extra pressure to be clever and witty. I'm sure you're all pro, so you don't feel the pressure. Take my lead from you. Yeah, I'm Kendall Clark, one of the founders of Stardog. When my two co-founders and I met at an artificial intelligence laboratory, one of several at University of Maryland, College Park back in the day, it was pretty apparent pretty early that we would start a company. And the question back then is, why are three AI guys starting a data management company? And my answer was, because no one's funding AI right now. This was a long time ago. That was the real answer. But the other real answer was, I thought that there was going to be a collision between data management, which everybody knows what that is, and a more rarefied or a less well-known area, knowledge management, which has been a kind of a spin-off of library science in some ways. It's kind of knowledge management is just what happens when early AI and library science kind of gets together and makes a baby, and that baby goes into the big enterprise and helps manage data in a more thoughtful, high-level way. So this intersection that maybe one of the only times I've called the future, I thought there was this collision course. The difference between my prediction, or my thought, my belief, and what happened is that took a decade longer than I anticipated, which is not that surprising. But large language model, generative AI, over the last 18 months is, and now I'm like, breathe a sigh of relief. I just made a gesture. We're on a podcast. I'll catch up in a second, Dan. You can't doubt the collision course now. Like, every data management company is now an AI company. Every AI company kind of perforce has to either be a data management company or give serious thought in a new way to data. I like to compare this to fancy race cars that run on high octane jet fuel. And in our world, we created the precursors of high octane jet fuel before we invented fancy race cars. It could have been the other way around, and we could have motorsports where the fuel is produced much the same way that beer is produced in Brooklyn, like this artisanal small batch kind of thing, and you could just run the Indy 500 that way. It's perfectly conceivable. That's kind of how it turned out with us in data. Like we have all this data, that's the fuel, and AI in some ways is the new fancy engine that runs on that fuel. And what we're really focused on at Stardog is the intersection of those two things in the sense that first, there needs to be a reliable industrialization of data, if you will, to power all these AI insight engines. And then inside of that larger vision, the recent launch of VoiceBox is about enabling ordinary folks. Knowledge workers is a fancy term for just saying people in an enterprise who know things but don't program. Right. This is an important constituency, and it's telling, I think, that there's not a good name for it. We in the software business, I know you've had this conversation like I have a million times. It's very unsatisfying. We break the world down into technical people and not technical people. And all we mean by that, by the technical people, is the people who can program, and the not technical people are everyone else. And that's kind of nonsense, right? Like, so our customers and users are business analysts in supply chain who have lived abroad, speak 3 languages, 2 master's degrees, and know everything about producing drugs from raw feedstocks globally. That's an extraordinarily technical human being, right? And the vision behind VoiceBox is to give that person access to the data so they can do their job, have those aha moments you mentioned, and basically get IT out of the way, right? So in that sense, I am very long on AI and very short on the notion that there's a skills gap and everybody needs to learn SQL and Python. I think that's bullshit. That's a technical term. It's nonsense. And I think, this is one of the places where Stardog and People Rain, different kind of companies to be sure, but I think we have that kind of in common. We're both trying to, as sappy as it may seem, empower the people, right? With access to the good stuff. And I do believe the most important algorithm in the world, or that we know of, is a smart, well-informed, motivated person with a little bit of free time to think, right? And that's who creates value in this world, or that's what creates value in this world. And we're trying to, with Startup VoiceBox, let them do that more often, right? I'll stop there.
So you and I are steeped in the domain of knowledge management, but many listeners probably aren't familiar. It seems kind of jargony. And maybe if you could unpack knowledge management pre and post AI, and if you could, talk us through a customer story. Make it real for us.
Yeah. So, okay. I tipped my hand already by just saying, like, knowledge management pre-AI, you really should think about as library science, like all the work that librarians do to organize information as an explicit bit. That's their work, right? Their inputs are, if I can be a little academic about it for a second, their inputs are the construction of knowledge. Like, we have industries in our world that one of their jobs or one of their purposes is to create knowledge. And that's not necessarily new facts, but valuable, impactful facts, solutions to problems effectively. Universities do that, right? Pharma does that in some ways. We were talking before about some mutual customers we have in the scientific laboratory instrumentation kind of space. We mentioned NASA. These are just organizations where the point of which is to find out new things that make life better, right? Give us more control over nature, for obvious benefits, explore the universe. How does reality work? Even things as non-dramatic as, therapeutic, sociological, psychological things for managing human nature, managing wellness, and this is also knowledge production capability. Before AI, knowledge management was typically an enterprise function that was trying to explicitly, in a kind of on the model of library science, organize the knowledge of the business. Now, not the data of the business. This distinction is crucial. The data is what's in the documents, the sentences and words, and it's also the records in the databases. There's other sources of data, but that's the biggest lumps of data in the enterprise. So knowledge management was not intended to organize data. It was intended to organize knowledge, schemas, policies, normative things that have to be true for the enterprise to work. Now, after AI, and the collision course that I was like kind of betting on, is now we have the joke I've been making recently is I have always thought of documents as kinds of degenerate databases. They're like crappy little databases with a terrible query language, right? But now in the Gen AI era, we have powerful query languages for documents, and they act a little bit more like a database. So knowledge management is changing under pressure of Gen AI, in just in the sense that the work people do is still valuable and still matters to organizing information, but the work itself has changed, right? So there's less explicit input. I'm going to arrange all these topics and papers into a tree of knowledge. This is what the key output of knowledge management in the West is the Library of Congress subject headings, which is this extraordinarily huge, you're nodding your head, multi-volume thing that just organizes basically everything people know into a big tree, and so that everything finds its place. Exactly, so that spatially, this is 2024. For younger listeners, this will seem a strange thing, but I promise, we used to go to these large buildings, and that's where the knowledge was. And we would move around spatially throughout, like go to the 5th floor if you're interested in religious studies, my old field, go to the 8th floor if you're a chemical engineer, and if you're wanting to learn about fractionization of polymers in the petrochemical refinery, that's the 7th shelf on the 8th floor. If you turn right at the elevator, like that's where the knowledge was. And the point of Library of Congress subject headings was to organize that physical space and thereby organize knowledge. In the post-web world, the post-internet world, and now the AI world, where AI is kind of a real thing, that work is going to change, and we don't really go to those places anymore so much, although the universities are still full of libraries. But the work of organizing knowledge in a more fluid and adaptable way, we're going to push off onto computers. And the benefits of that, both for enterprise, for any kind of large organization, are pretty abundant. And in terms of a user story, I guess maybe we can talk about NASA for a second. They've been a customer of Stardog for many years. And what we do there is partner with them to organize the flow of information around return to Moon and Mars mission planning and actual mission launch, right? So that's a knowledge production, a large scale distributed, human knowledge production effort, but it also results in rocket science, rocket ships that actually go places. And that process for NASA is multidisciplinary, obviously multi-organizational, in the sense that there is a large manufacturing supply chain. Somebody makes the rocket, there's other people make the crew capsule, but then there's a breakdown. There's this firm in Alabama that makes this one high-speed ceramic fitting that goes onto the nozzle of this, right? It's just an extraordinary large organizational effort. And the data flow and the data silos and connecting all that up in a meaningful way so that NASA can say, hey, we've done bidirectional traceability. Every functional system and every breakdown of functional system of this large engineered product, this rocket ship, we can trace backwards to 1 million design requirements that justify these parts existing and functioning in the way they do. And then we can trace forward to the test, verification, and validation of every one of those parts and pieces, the rational disposition of faults and problems, right? It's just an extraordinary undertaking. There's a lot of data silos, and Knowledge Graph, Stardog in particular, has been extraordinarily helpful at NASA to help them organize that information in a distributed fashion without having to build one big, materialized warehouse or new silo of this data. And then on top of that, the VoiceBox effort or new product is just in some ways just democratizing access to that data for the people who just have a question and don't want to learn a BI tool, certainly don't want to learn a query language. Again, NASA is a great example of what I said earlier. I still haven't met anybody at NASA that doesn't have at least one master's degree. I know all the people I know who have 3 PhDs all work at NASA. So to say to these people, you've got 3 PhDs, you're also a doctor, right? Like there's a guy, he's a doctor, he was an Army Ranger, and now he's an astronaut. That's an actual guy in the world, okay? Korean American fellow, I think his last name is Kim, something like that. I was just reading about him. Classic NASA guy. I'm going to say to that guy, well, the problem, man, is you don't know Python, right? That's just a profound failure of our industry, in my opinion. So VoiceBox is meant to step into that gap and say, hey, man, you know enough. It isn't about what you know. It's about colliding what you know and what's in your head with the data that you don't know. And let's see what happens for NASA, for you, for space mission, for, God knows what, right?
So Kendall, it feels like there are two maybe contradictory themes there. Just unpacking maybe the NASA example. So Dr. Kim, it seems like, has maybe a data kind of aggregation and normalization problem, and it would be helpful to have the benefit of voice or AI to maybe ask questions of data strewn across disparate sources. But to me, that's different from, I love the term, documents as degenerate databases, where a knowledge worker, not a Dr. Kim, might want to unlock or discover data in documents. It seems like it's at NASA scale, the problem isn't degenerate databases and documents. It's much bigger than that. Is that fair? Or how do you assess that?
I don't, well, look, I take your point, but I don't think about it the way I think. I'll make a generic comment, which I like to do as a former philosopher. But I think it's true, right? Like that's an accurate perspective, but I don't think it's helpful. I don't think that doesn't give me any leverage on the problem, right? Here's what I mean. Most of the time, in fact, almost all of the time, I think we obscure this in the industry too. Almost all of the time, I don't care. This is why I call documents degenerate databases. Documents and databases have this in common. They're both containers for knowledge. What's interesting about a container full of knowledge is not the container. What's interesting is the knowledge it contains. But documents and databases are otherwise quite profoundly different. Like in almost every way you can imagine, different life cycle, different interfaces, different APIs, different inputs, outputs, different content. One we call unstructured, or at best semi-structured, the other we call structured, right? And so here's another example that large language models are sensitizing everyone to. You can look at a document and it typically, there are examples, counterexamples, but typically a document comes with context and background, and the facts and the background are all kind of a mishmash. It's a narrative, right? It's for a person to read and consume. A database is a kind of, we use the word normalization or denormalization, but I like to use the word shredding. We take real world context and we tear it into little atoms, and we spread the atoms all around the structure for fast retrieval. That's also super important. But a database in some sense assumes you know what you're looking for, and you know what you know. I just need the pressure rating of this valve at 0 gravity when it's really hot. And that's just a number or a range of numbers. Maybe it has a certainty value, right? I could look through a million pages of documentation to find that, or I can just do a query. But the difference between the facts I need to do my business or the facts Dr. Kim needs to be presented with in order to have an aha moment, that they live in one kind of container or another, is almost always irrelevant. Like, I don't ever remember Dan saying, hey, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going on Dan's podcast on Friday. I need Dan's phone number, right? I better call him. Where is that thing? I just need it. I don't care where it is, right?
So as technologists, we're great, particularly entrepreneurs, we're insanely great at asking and answering the question, what could go right? And we're always thinking about a vision for the future that gets us on Mars faster and does crazy things like that.
Yeah.
AI is introducing a whole bunch of other questions that I would posit are equally important for entrepreneurs to ask and answer. And that's a set of questions around what could go wrong. So when you think about, at NASA scale or any of your other customers, what could go wrong if AI provides unfettered access to data and we start to do things with data and it has some unintended consequences? What could go wrong in the case of the use cases you've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, this is really an important question, Dan, for a bunch of reasons. I don't know if we can even get to all of them. The one I want to start with is I'm very, very intensely focused these days on what I call the failure mode of my approach, right? Or what I don't call it. That's just what it's called, the failure mode. Exactly. What happens to the user when it doesn't work? Okay. And I'm focused on this because VoiceBox takes you know me a little bit. I like contrarian approaches, so it's not a surprise that VoiceBox takes a contrarian approach. As we sit here today in early March of 2024, and for like the last year, retrieval augmented generation is RAG is the rage, is my little joke. It's all the rage, and everybody's doing RAG. And because I sell to regulated industries, like, going to Mars and managing the world economy and putting drugs in human bodies for health. These are organizations. Now, I don't think there's any normal constituent for getting it wrong. Nobody's going around advocating for error that I'm aware of, not intentionally. That's not their goal. But in a regulated industry, it's especially important to get it right. Like, it's super critical. So that's why I talk about failure mode. The failure mode of RAG is what an economist would call pernicious error. And by pernicious, I just mean it's subtle, therefore it's super hard to detect. Therefore, it's super hard to correct and repair. Like, so RAG and LLMs will just, if I can use a technical term, I don't know if this is a family podcast, but they'll just make shit up, right? And the shit they make up is pernicious because it's convincing. Like in other words, I'm looking, the running theme here is I'm looking for Dan's phone number because I got to be in his podcast. What if I find it and it's one digit off? And it's not the the area code, right? It's just the last number of the last part. I'll never be able to figure that out, right? And I go around thinking I have your phone number, I cannot reach you. That's a pernicious error, particularly when it's introduced randomly, right? And I have none of these RAG chat systems give you any human affordance for correcting or repairing. They're all talking, the state of the art now is we're reducing the frequency of hallucinations. Well, from what to what? 60 to 40% from, I mean, in a regulated industry, 0 is the only really acceptable number. So the alternative that Stardog takes, and it's clear in the literature, we did not create this. It's called semantic parsing. I'll be a little nerdy for a second. This is an AI podcast. The failure mode of semantic parsing is a person, we'll go back to Dr. Kim. I hope I got that name right, by the way. If we've invented this guy, I have confabulated, I have hallucinated. But there is a guy like that. I may forgive my apologies if I've got his name wrong. He has a question. So he is in an epistemic debt. There's something he wants to know that he doesn't know. He comes to a RAG system. He asks this question, and maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 or 1 in 3 times, it just makes some stuff up. He goes off thinking that's real, not good. In a semantic parsing based chatbot or approach to, democratizing data access for people, the failure mode is the system says, I don't know. Right? That's what happens when it goes wrong. And my argument here, and the reason we've adopted this approach is the user is not benefited by I don't know, but they are not made any worse off. They came to the question, they came to that question because they didn't know. The machine doesn't know either. They have not been harmed and they have not been tricked or fooled. That's a not, we don't like that failure mode. We're working hard to make it happen 1 in 20, 1 in 100, eventually not at all. But what happens when you go wrong in the approach we take is, well, you're no worse off, right? And I think if you amplify that across the organization, you can see, some care and concern for responsible AI, which for me is gotten a little bit ideological around, what I think we call rent seeking. There's a lot of market leaders who want to freeze out others. I understand why they want to do that. Responsible AI to me starts with responsible tool usage. These things are just tools. I like to translate anything somebody tells me about responsible AI into talk about power tools and children on job sites, right? Like a handsaw on a construction job site is a very useful tool. No one would say we can't have power tools on job sites. That would be insane. But then sometimes through a lack of foresight or responsibility, morally blameworthy foresight, I'll say, a child may, or just a person may wander onto a job site and chop a finger off. It's a terrible thing, right? We wouldn't talk about, well, we got to ban power tools. No, Dan, let's ban electricity. The children's, like nobody says that, but when you hear a lot of talk in the AI space that is kind of equivalent to that. And I don't understand that except as, power, AI and big companies are certainly powerful. They're going to work to defend themselves both materially and ideologically. And I think I would like to hear more counter voices to this, responsible AI thing. I think we need more precision. We need to grow up a little bit, and we need to sort of demystify the AI business. If it's not a regulation you'd pass on a carpenter about the use of his tools, I think you should ask yourself, is it a regulation or a posture we should limit ourselves with these tools? And of course, I should say this is all against the backdrop of I have deep skepticism that AI in my lifetime is going to get out of control and going to become sentient. I think that's all hooey. I refuse to believe it. There's no reason to believe any of that stuff. So I guess if you have this view that, somebody will say that's clever, well, a power tool isn't going to be godlike. Well, fair enough. Okay. A godlike power tool, we want to regulate differently. But I think it's just as likely that a large language model becomes godlike as a Black and Decker, hand tool does. I'm very short on that idea. So maybe that explains my skepticism. But yeah, anyway, I appreciate the question. It is an important question for folks like us. What happens when things go wrong?
So I'm going to dig a little deeper in that. I don't know is not a satisfying answer for a technical audience because it's not binary. When we're talking about automated decision making, hey, look, there are a lot of Dans and a lot of phone numbers. And the AI may be pretty sure that this one is Dan's phone number and it may be one digit off. So that it implies there's some kind of a confidence threshold that determines whether the automation risks making a false positive, making a recommendation that is one digit off versus a false negative where it says, I don't know, and maybe it actually did know. How do you think about instrumenting that trade-off between false positives and false negatives before having the bot err on the side of being conservative and just saying, I don't know, which is casually maybe correct, but may not be as helpful as it could be?
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. It's definitely not as helpful as it could be. But the difference between those two is the difference between an error, a pernicious error in principle that you can't really avoid, and a failure to satisfy in fact that we're working every day to eliminate, right? So I think that is the right prudential balance between hurting people and helping them. Like, let me put it this way. I don't think confusing people and enlightening people are symmetric, right? I think it's much worse to confuse people than it is good to enlighten them, because there's an alternative. Those are not the exclusive possibilities. There's this middle ground of just refusing to do either or not doing either. You can just be like, again, I think well, I'll say it this way. Everybody gets pissed off. I get pissed off when the machine says, I don't know. The job of the machine is to know. But we love it when a person says, I don't know, right? And I think we might want to start sort of adjusting our priors about the value of a computer, of a program that tells us, I don't know, while at the same time, we as the vendor working night and day to reduce the frequency of I don't know. And I think if we can get it to 1% of the time, that's at least, and I'll say too, I want to be carefully saying, like, my focus, my ICP, as we say, as we CEOs like to say, are regulated industries. In the B2C space, where let's say Dan, you and I start a business next and we're going to build a virtual girlfriend or a virtual therapist, okay? Or a thing that helps you write a novel, or send your mom a really creative Mother's Day card, okay? Like, the hallucinations are different there. The hallucination there is not a bad thing. It's a source of creativity. Making stuff up when you're a poet makes you be a great poet, right? Making stuff up when you're a supply chain analyst and you're trying to get drugs into human bodies and make your number and not kill anybody or whatever, those are just profoundly different. The underlying thing is the same. So my view here, I care about error, but my view is not that we ban LLMs because they can be wrong. No, we just have to use them correctly, right? So in the B2C space, or I mean, I don't know that space very well. I'm caricaturing a little bit, but I can think of many uses of an LLM or Gen AI where that confabulation, which is a more neutral term than hallucination, is a source of creativity, and then it's a good thing. I'm not aware of people running around in the regulated industry space saying, our problem is we lack creativity, right? I mean, no, they got to get it right. They're like scientists that way. So I think that's the difference. But then, of course, the other thing is, as the tech state of the art advances, we want to drive, I don't know, the failure mode of semantic parsing to close to zero. It's not at zero now, although we launched this week with on average about 87% in early access of the questions that got answered. So I feel pretty happy about that. We're going to get it acceptably close to zero. I don't know that it'll ever be zero, but again, given my market and my users and what matters, I'm happy with that balance.
It's a much more satisfying answer. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Power tools and children. We got to come back to that one.
It's so dramatic. It's so dramatic. I know. I'm being a little bit demagogic.
It's a wonderful visual. Kendall, who gets to decide what's a power tool and what's a child? Is it the federal government? Is it Mark Zuckerberg? Is it you and I?
Did
What's
you know
that one?
Yeah. Did you see this thing? This is slightly off topic, but I don't think so. Did you see this thing? I saw this headline this week. I'm 55, so I'm not new here. And I've been an avid consumer of media my entire life. I saw this week the most remarkable headline of my life, and it went like this: White House recommends memory safe languages to technical world, i.e., you could rewrite it. White House doesn't want people writing C and C++. And I thought I was going to die of astonishment.
I saw the Twitter storm, the tweet storm that evoked. And
Look,
yeah,
it's not that it's wrong. I'm an old Python guy. Rust is awesome. Memory safe languages are lovely. I'm not against, but like C and C++ are what run the bloody world. And there's something irreplaceable about C because after all, it is not that C is less memory safe than Rust. The question is C is more productive than assembler. Like it's just I mean, look, when I vote Democrat. I'm not ashamed of that. I don't really, I'm not proud of it either. So I'm kind of inclined towards Team Blue a little bit, but that was embarrassing. So I don't want more of that, right? So a government has a role, the sovereign has a say, and I acknowledge that. I'm in regulated industries, and I write all the time about why they're regulated and what that means, and it's all about the sovereign has a say. We may end up as a regulated industry as well. I accept the inevitability of that, perhaps. Not that it perhaps accepted, perhaps that it's inevitable, except that it's maybe inevitable. But again, this is a place where we got to get it right. And I just want there to be no hysteria. I don't want I have to say, you live in the Valley, I do not. Although kind of culturally, I live in the Valley, right? Because I'm in the software business. We all do, no matter where we live. There's this strange cult in the Valley, and I use the word cult as a former religious studies scholar, use it intentionally, about this bizarre worship of the machine, and the machine's going to overtake us. And there is a well-known AI safety researcher who literally claims he's got like a young child. His children is none of my business. I don't question him as a father. But he said recently he wished maybe he shouldn't have had a kid because now she's going to be in this world where AI is going to, and I did, Dan, like, my favorite philosopher, Wittgenstein, used to say, at some point in an argument, my spade is turned, which is to say he hits bedrock and he just can't go any further. He doesn't know what to say. And when I hear people say that, people with PhDs in computer science, who have mostly experienced what I've experienced, failed to get the code to compile, and then the algorithm was wrong. They say that in all seriousness, and they really believe it. I don't know what to say to that, but I fear that climate. That is not a climate conducive to good public policy, right? It terrifies me that people actually believe that. And I'm very suspicious of it, right? I think there's a lot of incumbents, like you're an AI startup like I am. There are big, big, powerful forces, companies that we compete with, and they have a lot of influence. And all things being equal, many of them like to freeze the market, right? And I think it's this cult is doing service for them unwittingly, perhaps. And more than anything, I just want to be able to say what I'm saying now and there not be, I don't care if there's repercussions, but I want there to be an open climate where we can debate and question everything, including this narrative that we're somehow about to create a thing that we're going to lose control of and it's going to take over the planet. 100% false. And if you believe that in good faith, mazel tov, right? Like I don't, fine. I'm not in the business of changing those people's views. There's a lot of people who don't know better and don't realize how extraordinary that is. And those are the people I want to persuade that you should really be very skeptical of that. And when people make further extraordinary claims on the lines of regulation, like let's freeze this nascent industry, where we didn't freeze the internet, we didn't freeze the cloud, and that turned out really good for all of us. We shouldn't freeze this. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but they require extraordinary true evidence. And the likelihood that the AI is going to get away from us is an extraordinary claim. And if it were true, okay, but it isn't. And I think people should just say that more clearly. Like, I mean, you have engineering teams working on this stuff, so do I. Are you hearing them say, oh my God, we may lose control? Or does it sound to you, we're both been in the business forever, does it sound like normal software development, where we're testing and things mostly don't work, and then they work, and then you make small advances? Like it just, I mean, I listen to my engineering teams very carefully. They're working with AI, LLMs 24 hours a day now, and it's just good old software development, little steps at a time. We test, we step, we fail, we fail, we fail, we succeed. Just ordinary stuff. We are not on the cusp of some new age of anything that lofty, in my view. And that matter, that should be expected. That's the ordinary thing. It's what we should expect. So in that sense, it's not interesting at all, except that there are other people in the policy space, I'm no big fan of necessarily of OpenAI, but the reasons that Sam Altman got ousted, there are people on that board who really believe that, like the AI Jesus was going to come out of the machine and take over the world. It's just, anyway.
Tom Wheeler, who was the former FCC chair, who famously championed net neutrality, under the
Mhm.
Obama administration was on the podcast recently, and he shared something that blew my mind. I believe someone can fact check this in the archives, but one member of Congress has an engineering degree. And he actually went on to make the argument why it's still okay to have Congress regulate AI. I disagree. My question for you is, should Dan Turchin grade PeopleRain's homework, and should Kendall Clark grade Stardog's homework? Is that the right path to regulation? Should we regulate ourselves, or who should be watching over us to make sure what we develop is done in a way that is responsible?
Well, let me go back to the point you made about Congress. I live near DC. I lived in DC till recently for 15 years, like literally in the city. I love to throw rocks at Congress. Every American does. It's our birthright, and it's very popular. And Congress has never been popular in the history of this country. There's a book about this, and it's good to read for some historical perspective. But I won't throw that rock at Congress. I do not have an engineering degree, sorry to say, uh, and and this platform is my technical vision. So engineering degrees are funny things. I would just say that there's not a single member of Congress who has the slightest idea how to think algorithmically. I do not have an engineering degree, but I know how to do that. And so just to be, not to correct Tom Wheeler, he's a smart, important guy, but the real failure is generally a failure in the culture. And while I say I don't want to tell people with many master's degree to learn Python to do their job, I do think general computer literacy, by which I really 100% mean think algorithmically, is super important. So if I could wave a magic wand, I wouldn't teach anybody Python. I would teach lots of people just how to think algorithmically. I don't program anymore, but I could sit in any programming conversation with anybody on the planet and contribute, right? So that's important. Now, to your other point, no, I mean, I'm kind of a capitalist. I think the market should decide. I think the market should grade. I mean, the first thing to say is, let's say that we are going to do something just counterfactually. Either of us is going to do something horribly irresponsible with our AI, but we just shit the bed commercially, pardon the French. It doesn't matter. I mean, like, why spend time on, who cares? So the companies that matter should be the ones that are viable. And the market has a good way of sniffing out BS. One of the things I'm arguing for here is making an anti-rent seeking position, rent seeking just being the idea that the sovereign's going to distort the market on behalf of its friends, right? Which I think is the function of all this cult of AI godliness or whatever, powerfulness. So I think that will hurt the market. I think that will actually create space for either just sloppiness, accidental harm, or just malfeasance, right? So the market should decide. It's too complex a question otherwise. There should be guardrails. I think there's this Chesterton quote about, you don't take down a fence until you don't take down a fence until you know why it was put up to begin with. And I think there's also these are, engineering homilies that I grew up on professionally. There's the other one about Christopher Alexander, the guy who's the architect who brought this sort of pattern thinking, uh, was the designer of some campus for the University of Oregon. And he laid out the campus and refused to put sidewalks. And they were like, what the hell, man? It's not finished. And he goes, no, no, no. In 2 years, after people have used this space, we will sidewalk over the pathways. Like, I don't know where people are going to walk. Let's just let them figure it out. And I think in those two kind of homilies, there's my preferred approach to AI regulation. Like, let the market decide, look at the winners, and bad cases make for bad law. Bad cases and rent seeking makes for terrible regulation. I don't want to squelch possibility. I don't want to freeze the market. I don't want to hurt people with my product, God forbid. And I don't really know anybody who does want to do that. But I know lots of people who will do almost anything to make more money. And I think the harm from AI that's worth talking about is not this fantastical, we lose control of the planet because there's an algorithm, right? Um, the harm is people are trying to make money and they have a more powerful tool. And on a small but meaningful in an aggregate basis, they just erode people's privacy. They erode some consumer protection. It's undramatic, Dan, and it's like not very sexy, and it's not going to catalyze, some VC to put another $1 trillion in or whatever. but it's the real thing that's in front of us. So if I think policy conversations must be had by adults, let me put it that way, serious, sober-minded, frankly, boring people who are focused on real harms and the prevention of real harms, not telling scary stories to make the know nothings in Congress jump around and do something stupid, right?
Yeah, no, we are just getting started, and we're going to pick up a lot of these themes in our next conversation. So I'm gonna commit you to another one of these, all right?
Happily.
Now, I'm not letting you off the hot seat without answering one last question for me, all right? This is an important one. So in 286 episodes, you're the first guest who has used the term epistemic debt. And you also alluded to what I'll say is your non-traditional background for being a
Yeah.
high-tech CEO. Tell all of the aspiring entrepreneurs who may also have non-traditional backgrounds what it takes to come from, oh, let's say an ABD, an all but dissertation in religious studies as a PhD,
Yeah, yeah.
to being in the seat that you sit in today.
Okay, in as few words as possible, you got to grind. This is why, someday after 20 years, when I'm an overnight success, people go, "Oh, it's so you're blah, blah, blah," and I'll be like, "Yeah, okay, whatever." When Jensen said this week that he had washed a lot of dishes and cleaned a lot of toilets, I did that a lot too. But the grinding I mean is, yeah, I'm a second career guy, and I just stopped for 3 years. Now, in retrospect, this was maybe a mistake. I should have went and gotten a job at Google. My first VC term sheet would have been a lot better if I'd done that. Instead, I just read computer science for 3 years nonstop and taught myself. So I haven't had a class. I still haven't had a computer science class, but I had some kind of education in that it was self-directed. And I took to AI because I had studied formal logic. And the nice thing about doing a degrees in philosophy is you learn how to interact with and even sometimes create rule-like systems, and you get pretty good at internalizing new bodies of knowledge. We were talking about that earlier. So, I mean, I was just having fun, right? I was just following my nose, as we like to say. I was just doing it for the sheer joy of it. But I had an eye towards I want to do this other thing. And so, like I'm not a traditional CEO. Like CEOs come in a couple buckets. There's the product CEO, the sales CEO, the marketing CEO, the engineering CEO. I like to say like third best in my company at every job, first best at none of them, right? The ultimate generalist. Oh, not ultimate in sense of good, but like I'm not afraid of doing any job, and I can get pretty good at almost anything with a little bit of work. And I got a high output and a high motor. I was taught to work hard. I'm very much a Protestant atheist in the sense of work ethic. And yeah, I mean, someone said to me recently, "Oh, you like to work hard. I like to work smart." And I said, "Actually, I like to do both. And the people who win are the people who do both. And you can control your effort." So I think, and I know this is kind of a cliche, but I mean this very seriously. Like I can simultaneously say I work 7 days a week and I've never worked a day in the last 10 years, right? Because I absolutely love what I do. I'm obsessively love what I do. And to me, it doesn't feel like work. And this thing that I don't call work, I do all the time, right? And I'm not saying that to brag or whatever, but um, as well as I do, Dan, that the entrepreneur game is very difficult. The odds are very long against success. The last thing I can live with myself someday, no matter the outcome, if I can look back, in my heart, this isn't a matter of accountability outside anywhere, but inside of me, I can just say I did everything I could, right? And if I couldn't say that, I couldn't live with myself. So that's my motivation. And yeah, this non-traditional background. I mean, everybody's making this shit up as they go. There is no such thing as traditional background. I guarantee you, Sam Altman, if he has a computer science degree, he had no more than 2 AI courses. Not to shit on Sam Altman, of course, but dude, like we're making a new thing every day. Nobody went to school for this stuff. It's fine, right? You've got to find that little imposter voice inside you and strangle it mercilessly, right? So anyway, yeah.
Brilliant. Well said.
Thank you.
Kendall, thanks for hanging out. This has been a lot of fun.
I appreciate it, Dan.
We're going to have you back again. But before I can let you go, where can audience learn more about you and Stardog and VoiceBox?
Stardog.com is the kind of normal place. Stardog.ai has the VoiceBox stuff. We kind of launched a new property this week. My marketing team will kill me if I only say the .com. There's some stuff at both places. But yeah, we got into the market on Wednesday. It's available in Stardog Cloud, and anybody can get a free trial by filling out a name and email address and get started. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we can make of it. And I appreciate the time and the attention, the interest, Dan.
We're all rooting for you. All right. Come back soon. Hang out again. All right.
I will do that. Thank you.
All right. Well, that is all the time that we have for this week on AI and the future of work. I'm your host, Dan Turchin from PeopleRain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.